Good morning, everybody. How are you? I'm sorry about the sound quality on this. I'm sick, so maybe it's better that we didn't meet in person today, but also I hope that this gave you either a few hours of sleep or at least kept you out of the snow and the ice. So we do need to keep caught up with secondary source integration, and unfortunately the calendar for English 110 is very tight. So although I wanted to keep everyone safe, we can't completely spare class time today. Let's consider this our regular class. The wonderful thing about having this on screencast is that you can pause me, you can rewind me, you can put me in full screen mode. So if you look at the very bottom right hand corner of your YouTube window, there's probably a little option down here. I bet it looks something like this button right here that will full screen me and will make it easier for you to see the content. I really recommend watching this in full screen mode. And I'm just going to proceed pretty much as I normally would in class. It's kind of a bummer because you guys can't play along and answer questions and all of that, but at least I'm hoping to deliver a little bit of course content today that will help you think about your secondary source integration over the next few days as we look ahead on the calendar. So just like on a regular day of class, let's go ahead and start with announcements. And I do have a few really critical announcements. One is that I see that many of you have already participated in the class discussion section on Carmen. So I'll just briefly go there. As we mentioned on Thursday, anyone who posted their essay late, you do not have to comment on that if it was more than 24 hours late. But I see also that some of you have not delivered your comments online. Please do. This is required homework, and failing to complete it can seriously hurt your participation grade and may even get you an incomplete in the class. And I would hate for that to happen, especially when it's such a simple, straightforward assignment. So please do make sure that your written comments make it up here onto the discussion board. For example, if you're commenting on Nikki's essay, you would just go ahead and click into her essay and click reply. And again, I see that many of you have in fact done this, and that for some people it's actually an issue of the essay was late. So for the most part, great job everybody, and those of you who have not gotten to it, I would get to it ASAP. Going back to the content section, as promised, I did look at our calendar and I've made some substantial revisions. So if you'll look in Module 1 under L, and again, please remember you can pause this video at any time if you need to go and do something else, like go to our Carmen site. So don't be shy about pausing me or rewinding me. In 1L, you'll see our new daily course schedule. I did a lot of moving around of dates to make sure that we could accommodate all the things that we've gotten a little bit behind on, but also making sure the dates are as generous as possible for you. So in the near term, looking ahead, things that will interest you a great deal. Homework for Thursday, I can't imagine by now that any of you have not read Commonplace Manual Chapter 2, but if you haven't, please read that for Thursday, because on Thursday I will be introducing you to the Analytical Research Paper assignment sheet. So that big assignment that will follow our SSI, it's worth 30% of your grade, and we'll start talking in more earnest, serious terms about how analysis turns into argument. So it will be important to review just this one chapter for Thursday. If you've already read it, just give it another quick look. If you haven't read it, please read it carefully. We're still in the fail blog week, so please be sure to post on the blog. A small, tiny note on the blog. I know this is so easy to do, so if you've done this, you're certainly not in trouble. But you'll notice that on the blog, some people are posting their own individual posts instead of replying to the thread. So for example, here's an example. This one's from Rachel. Again, Rachel, you're not in trouble. Someone else did this last week too. But it really helps keep things tidy if you can try to remember to click on the reply link for the weekly blog. That will help keep everything neat. And if you want to respond to somebody else, for example, Jessica Grossman, you could click reply right onto her post and it would post directly underneath. So that's a minor housekeeping note. Do be sure that you get a comment in here on the fail blog post before Thursday at class time. Going back to our schedule, I have adjusted the secondary source integration due date to Saturday. I want to give you as much time as I possibly can, so I've adjusted it to Saturday, February 5th at 6 p.m., and I'm sorry, but that really is as much time as I can give you, because I need to get these graded in order to accommodate conferences next week. And you'll see next week conferences are scheduled for this Tuesday, February 8th. We'll talk more about this in class on Thursday when we schedule the conferences. We will schedule those on good old pen and paper to make it easier for everybody. Let me see. What else? Looking ahead, your final analytical research paper is going to come up on us pretty darn quickly. Right now I have you scheduled to submit a draft of that paper on Saturday the 12th. And then that final paper will be due in 2 weeks, so it will be due on Saturday, February 19th. So this is going to sneak up on us pretty darn quick. So I would encourage you, after you finish your secondary source integration, take a little breather, but don't breathe too hard because we're definitely going to move into that final research paper pretty quickly. So that covers some of our schedule changes. I'm going to deliver a lot of content today using this PowerPoint presentation and by sort of literally walking you around on the internet. But please, if you have any trouble seeing this screencast or understanding what I'm saying, you need some kind of sound captioning or some other accommodation, please don't hesitate to ask. I know this is an unusual format to have our course, and again, I would really suggest watching this in full screen mode. First, let's just take a very brief return look at the secondary source integration handout. And I am going to walk us through this together on Thursday, but I want to kind of hit a couple of the key points. One very key point that I think we covered last week is when we say 3 to 4 pages in length, that includes a revised version of your PSA assignment. So I'm not expecting 3 to 4 new pages of content. I'm expecting the 1 to 2 pages that remain from your PSA that you want to keep, in addition to your secondary source integration. And a lot of people just literally stack them one on top of the other. There's the PSA, and then they start writing the SSI right after that. Okay? So, I want to remind you, at least one of your sources does need to be a scholarly source, preferably from a peer-reviewed journal. I expect you to make a good faith effort on this. You know where to find them on the library website. You know that magic box to check on the search engines if you're not absolutely sure what a peer-reviewed journal is. If you're still not sure what constitutes a scholarly source, there's this wonderful help source in Carmen Content Module 5, Popular versus Scholarly Sources. And this will help you identify the difference. And today I'll show you a sample scholarly source and we'll work from it productively. A lot of this is going to feel a little bit like gobbledygook, but I hope that after this presentation today by PowerPoint, as we go into Thursday, some of this will make a lot more sense to you. But I do want to show you the very strong emphasis here on using the strategies from writing analytically regarding sources, and that's really the focus of my lecture today here on YouTube. So the goal is really to help you with the secondary source analysis integration assignment sheet. So I hope that this screencast will be really critical for you. So let's talk a little bit about secondary sources and what you do with them. So just to quickly review what we've already covered, at this point I would recommend that you pause and get your writing analytically out. So definitely get writing analytically. We've already talked a little bit from our handout on Tuesday about how to use sources and how to integrate them. You might remember there was a 3-step process to integrating sources. Let's go ahead and pull up that handout now from Thursday. Step 1, you want to introduce the quote with critical information about it, and you get to decide what that critical information is, what your reader really needs to know in order for them to feel convinced that this quote is important. Secondly, to present the quote, preferably taking 3 lines or less of the quote, so really getting to the specific meat and cheese of the quote that you feel is very important. And then thirdly, offering some kind of analysis, and that's really the focus of our discussion today in this lecture, is what do you actually do in that analysis section? Some of them are things you already know how to do from writing analytically. You can certainly do a notice and focus, a paraphrase times 3. You can use the method to identify repetition, strands, binaries, anomalies. That is all absolutely par for the course. But for certain kinds of evidence, that's not going to feel as effective or you're going to get kind of stuck. We also talked briefly about works cited lists. Again, I want to emphasize, I do expect you to have a works cited list for your SSI. If you don't have a works cited list, your assignment may be considered incomplete, so definitely have one. I will be somewhat generous about what it looks like since this is your first attempt, but I do expect you to attempt it, just like I expected you to attempt the research question in the primary source analysis. Finally, I kind of glossed over this, so I wanted to go over it briefly again. I was talking here about how you refer to authors. The first time you mention an author in an outside essay, you want to give their whole name. So for example, in his essay, How to Get Out of a Locked Trunk, Philip Weiss. Right, so I've given his entire name. Sometimes it's useful to give their credentials too. Right, so something like Carrie Smith, who teaches introductory composition at Fairleigh Dickinson University. But after the first mention, after we already know that this guy's name is Philip Weiss or this lady's name is Carrie Smith, you can just call them by their last name, okay? So call Philip Weiss just Weiss, not Philip. It's a mark of respect. You can also use fill-ins like the essay, the author, this paragraph, and that will help sort of break up the flow and keep you from saying Weiss states, Weiss states, so the same name over and over again. Finally, there's the matter of what you need in your parentheses. The real rule here is that it's whatever came first in the works cited entry, which is usually an author's last name, but not always, plus the page number. Now, of course, there are cases where there is no page number, such as internet sources. Then you just don't state one. That's because there isn't one, right? So if there is no page number, you're scot-free. If we're in a book or an article where there are page numbers, you're expected to give a page number. What if there's no author? Then you would take whatever comes first in the works cited list. So let me give you some examples. Let's cruise over to the Purdue OWL very quickly. owl.purdue.edu. Oh, oops. This is what happens on live television. So let's go into that sample MLA works cited list, shall we? Where is that sample page? So on some of these sources, you'll see that in fact there is no author, like this very first source. It's just an article called Blueprint Lays Out Clear Path for Climate Action. In this case, you would simply take the first portion of this source. Now some teachers will tell you to take the entire name. I think that's certainly okay, right? So you could cite something like, let me get back into the document we were at. We'll use this one since we're here. For your parentheses, you could take this. Now notice that I brought the quotation marks with me, right? There were quotation marks in the original, so they came with me. If I were citing this source down here, I would take the italics with me, right? Because that is part of the format of how they were in the works cited list. So the moral of the story, whenever you commit to using a source in your paper, I strongly suggest that you immediately put them in the works cited list. And the reason for that is then you'll know what comes first in the citation and you'll be in a better position to create this parenthetical citation. Now notice in this first example, I've taken the first element from what's in the parentheses. And there's no page number because this is an internet source, right? So remember, there's no page number, excuse me, so there's no need to put anything there. So it would simply be that. There's my quoted title, Blueprint Lays Out Clear Path for Climate Action, and then the period after the parentheses. So my sentence would look something like blah, 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 in their article about blah, 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 and then I would figure out what to say about it, something like the Environmental Defense Fund claims blah, 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 and then here's my parentheses at the end. Globalwarming.org, similarly, would be in parentheses just like this. So again, give that a try in your homework. That's kind of a housekeeping issue. Now let's go back to our PowerPoint presentation. One of the key decisions you have to make early on with a source is whether you're going to quote, paraphrase, summarize it, or some combination. I will tell you that in most cases, for your secondary source integration, you'll want to quote the original source. Now, of course, there are exceptions. I've certainly seen papers where it really makes more sense in the secondary source integration to paraphrase or to summarize. Or in some cases, you have to do both, right? I've seen cases where maybe you need to summarize or paraphrase and then give a quote. But generally speaking, if your source isn't important enough that you want to quote from it, I might save that for the analytical research paper and focus instead in the secondary source integration on a source where you really wanted to pull a quote. That's a really good sign that you probably are using a source that's very important to your analysis. And we've talked already about the three-step process: introducing the quote, giving the quote, and analyzing the quote. Now that all makes it sound really easy, but now let's turn to writing analytically, and let's talk about some of those chapters that kind of got lost in our reading shuffle. We haven't had a chance to talk about them as much as I would hope. So first we're going to talk about writing analytically chapter 7. And again, I entreat you, please don't forget. you're welcome to follow along with your actual book. It's a really good idea. Put me on pause, put me on rewind, listen carefully to what I say. So first let's talk a little bit about Chapter 7. On page 110, and look, see, I'm actually going to go to page 110. There's a section called The Missing Connection Linking Evidence and Claims. And writing analytically makes the statement that the relationship between evidence and claims is rarely self-evident. That relationship virtually always needs to be explained. Now that sounds pretty abstract until you look at their example. Okay, this is their example of someone who is not linking evidence and claims. So let's look at this together. The party was great. There was no alcohol. Well, I know a lot of college students who actually think the exact opposite. Okay, they would say that the party was only great if there was alcohol. Or people might think a party is great if there's no alcohol, but there could be many reasons for that, right? For example, the party was great because there was no alcohol, and that meant that people really had to actually have conversations with each other instead of just bumping and grinding on the dance floor. And that meant that a lot of people got to make friends and really got to know each other. There's one explanation for a party with no alcohol. Another explanation might be the party was great. There was no alcohol. And that was really important because it was a party being held by Alcoholics Anonymous. So everyone at the party was an alcoholic. So the fact that there was no alcohol was really important because that kept everybody sober. They didn't have to worry about their alcoholism. They could enjoy the party and have a great time. Now notice, those are two completely different explanations for why the party was great, right? So even though there was evidence given for the party being great, the evidence is there was no alcohol, it wasn't really sufficient for the reader to understand how there was no alcohol hooks up to the party being great. And this happens in a lot of English 110 papers, and it's a very dangerous business. So let's talk about how we can avoid it. On the top of page 112 in Writing Analytically, they give an example of a paragraph that is all claims. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to pause this presentation right now, put me on pause, and I would like you to read this little paragraph. Okay, ready? Put me on pause. Oh, did you put me on pause? I'm glad you did and read this paragraph. If you didn't, you really should, because I'm not going to read it to you. You'll notice in this top paragraph, pretty much everything here is a claim. Right? So they don't necessarily give much evidence. They say that the owners are greedy. They say that the owners are losing money. They say that they fired the commissioner because the commissioner took the player's side. But there's not really any evidence that that's actually why the owners fired the commissioner. They say that baseball is a sport but not a business. But some people might say baseball is a business. So while all of this could potentially be a strong claim, without the evidence to back it up, it's just opinions, right? It's just stuff that sort of seems to come out of nowhere, and that really drops the writer's ethos because we don't know where they're getting these claims. By contrast, some writers try to pull off a strategy that looks kind of good at the bottom of the page, but is just as dangerous, where they give all evidence. So again, I'd like you to put me on pause and read this paragraph that begins, "Baseball is not a sport." So put me on pause, and I'll see you when you've had a chance to look at this paragraph. Okay, so you had a chance to read this paragraph? I'm glad. So even though this person gives a lot of really interesting facts about baseball teams and the parks that they're building and the very specific details of what those parks look like, there isn't really anything that directly links it to a claim. Right? It doesn't actually say why we should believe that this evidence means what the writer says that it does. It's possible that we could read this paragraph and actually get the exact opposite message. Right? This writer wants us to think that baseball is being threatened, and I think I could actually take this exact same evidence and say, you know what? This sounds like baseball is a thriving business, right? That baseball isn't threatened at all. If they're building luxury boxes and they're attracting players that are making millions of dollars, it seems to me that that's a really successful sport. But this guy wants me to think that baseball's not successful. So in fact, by giving evidence, even though he gave a lot of evidence, he hasn't necessarily helped anyone see things in his way, right? The mark of a great argument is to make someone change their thinking or their behavior. And that hasn't happened here, right? I got a claim that baseball is sort of failing and flunking, and I got some evidence and it's all about new luxury boxes and salaries, but that claim plus evidence didn't automatically equal a change in my thinking in the way that this person wanted. It caused the exact opposite. Right? It actually caused me to think, I think baseball's kind of thriving. So this person's doing a little bit better than the guy who's just making claims, but he's still in very bad shape. So let's talk about how you could move beyond this. Let's go to page 113. They talk about making the details speak. And as you read this section, which I've quoted right from the book, I want you to think about step 3 on our handout from Thursday about analyzing the quote. Okay, we're talking here about that part. After you've given the quote, how do you analyze the quote? And this is Writing Analytically's advice about how to do it. So they say, quote, say explicitly what you mean. Sorry, guys. Let me get us back on the right screen here. 1. Say explicitly what you take the details to mean. 2. State exactly how the evidence supports your claims. 3. Consider how the evidence complicates, qualifies your claims. Now, I don't know about you, but those sound like pretty dense, kind of difficult sentences to me. And the wonderful thing about writing analytically is that they tend to say things over and over again in a lot of different ways. So I bet if we keep on digging, we may actually find something in writing analytically that does make sense to us, that sort of unpacks this really important statement and makes it clear to us. So let's keep digging. On page 120, they ask these 2 really critical questions, and they're questions that you can ask too. Am I oversimplifying the implications of my evidence? Remember baseball guy? Right? Baseball guy who gave all of that great evidence about the luxury boxes and the players' salaries, but he simplified that to only mean one thing, which is that baseball was failing? That's what this guy was doing. He was oversimplifying the claim. And Rosenwasser and Stephen also asked, does my use of evidence go beyond mere corroboration of an overly general claim? In other words, do you just agree with the source? Now, I'm not telling you that it's a bad thing to agree with your sources. Okay, if you find a source and you look at the information on the page and you think, you know what? I agree with that. I think that's sound. I think that's reasonable. I'm convinced of that. That's absolutely fine. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. But if that's all you have to say about it is that you agree with it, that's a problem. Okay, we need to go beyond agreeing. It needs to start with agreeing, but it doesn't end with agreeing. So, let's talk about how to actually do this with a real sample scholarly source. And remember, this is a requirement for the SSI. A requirement. Okay, if you don't have one, this can seriously hurt your grade. So, let's take a moment to look at a real scholarly source. I'm going to use a scholarly source related to that Verizon Rule the Air commercial that we worked together with in class. Now, if you've forgotten that commercial, okay, here is the web address to the commercial, and I encourage you to go and watch it again on YouTube. You certainly don't have to understand the rest of this lecture, but just to remind you of the basics, this was that commercial with people, the girl who was tweeting in the office, the guy who was posting a YouTube video of the bubbles, the guy who was posting the Facebook status update of the pregnant wife. That's the commercial that we'll be talking about. So I figured out I could write a paper about that and ask this question, right? How does real-time constant access to social media sites affect usage patterns on these sites? So that's my research question. So I have something to guide my research. So off to the internet I went. I went to the library multi-search, right, which I queued through this screen, and I typed in social media use. I got this set of results. And the very first result was from something that I immediately recognized as a potential scholarly source. And I recognized that because of the boring name of the publication that says exactly what it is, telematics and informatics. I saw that it's measured in volumes and issues, another really key marker of a secondary source. I saw that it's extremely recent. It's actually from this year. It's marked May. Okay, so it's from like their latest and greatest issue. And I saw that it was several pages long, okay, more than 2 or 3 pages. So I thought, oh, sweet. Maybe this is a scholarly journal article. Now, the title at first didn't get me too excited, right? I looked at this title, The Media Use of American Youngsters in the Age of Narcissism, and I thought, I don't know if that's totally related to my question of how does real-time constant access to social media sites affect usage patterns on these sites. But I said, you know what? I'm going to give it a whirl, right? So I clicked on Find It with O-Links, right, to try and find it. And look, there is in fact a copy of it in the EJC, in the Electronic Journal Collection. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the PDF full text of this article. Now, before we go and find a sentence or two that we might want to use in my paper about the Verizon Rule of the Year commercial, I wanted to give you kind of a quick tour around the block of a scholarly source. There's some really key areas in a scholarly journal article that are often very similar no matter what field you're in. For example, they'll often have the journal information at the top or bottom of the page, so up here, or also sometimes down here. You'll find author information in the title at the top, and then there are a few key places in the article that I like to go first to determine if this article might be overall of use to me. One is the abstract. Almost all articles begin with a short abstract like this, at least in scholarly journals. If you see an abstract, there's a good chance you're looking at a scholarly journal article, a very good choice for your secondary source integration. And these abstracts are sort of quick previews of what the overall content of the article might be. So when I take a quick look at the abstract, I see some things that suggest that it's about digital life in the age of nonstop connection. Oh, that sounds like it might be related to my Verizon commercial. And then it says that it's focused on youngsters born after 1980, and I think, I don't know, that may not be the population exactly that I'm looking at. But I keep on reading. It talks about all kinds of different media. And I think, okay, I'm willing to give this a whirl, especially because it starts talking about American culture. Another key place that I'm going to look to get a feel for what this article is about overall, so that I know whether to invest my time in reading all of it, is I'm going to look at the end of the introduction section. It is very common in scholarly work for the introduction to end with kind of a preview of what the rest of the article is going to do. So in this article, it says, in this article, we attempt to present some data which characterize the cultural environment of so-called American millennials, the American teens and 20-somethings born after 1980 who are making the passage into adulthood, and how they deal with the globalized diffusion and localized appropriation of media products and processes. We try to describe the kind of culture they are communicating in, and the possible implications this may have for their identity formation and self-esteem. And I think to myself, you know what? I could maybe work with that. You know, it's not a perfect source. It doesn't talk about everybody who uses social media, but maybe I'll find something here, right? I might find a little piece of the puzzle. So again, I've looked at the abstract, I've looked at the end of the introduction, and now I'm going to scroll to the end of the article. Partly because when you get to the end of the article, there's usually a section that's a conclusion, right, that says sort of what the overall trend in the article is about. In this case, we get this wonderful summary about how future research might do things. For example, avenues for future research include developing a richer measure of social media use. Oh, that's really useful for my paper, because now I found a source that says it's kind of hard to measure how social media is being used. That's great for my paper. But also notice this list of references. This is like gold, okay? This list of references is everything that this person has listed in their article, and you can use this to your advantage. This person has basically given you all the sources that they looked at. And some of these sources, excuse me, some of these sources might be really useful for your paper. Okay, so one strategy might be to just go through this references list and look for names and titles that might be really relevant to your article. Another way to do it is, of course, just like you do, these articles are also going to cite their sources. In this case, they're using a different citation system called APA, but for example, let's say I'm really interested in this sentence. Recent studies seem to present a more complex and ambivalent picture, and it appears to be about social media use in Europe. Well, I could go and look at these studies by Carlson, Livingstone, Nordicom, etc. Watch this. I'm going to click on Carlson. It takes me right to the reference for Carlson, and look, it tells me exactly how to find that. So when you find a single scholarly source that really works for you, it can become this gold mine of other sources for your paper. So keep that in mind. Don't lose track of that. So now I've gone through a couple of the key things: abstract, title, end of the introduction, the conclusion, the references, and now I'm just going to scroll down and have a look at these headers, these bold-faced headers, and I'm going to see if I can see one that might really relate to my research paper. Aha! Okay, this section is called Basic Data on Young Adults and Their On and Offline Life. And down here in the section labeled Social Networking, I found some facts about adult social networking versus teenager social networking. And I'm especially interested in this sentence. Adults are increasingly fragmenting their social networking experience, as a majority of those who use social networking sites, 52%, say they have 2 or more different profiles. Also, the specific sites on which young adults maintain their profiles are different from those used by older adults. Bingo! This is really useful for my paper about that Verizon commercial, where I saw a lot of adult users using different kinds of social media sites, right? YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. Well, now we have research evidence that, in fact, according to this study, adults are fragmenting their social networking presence, right? They're not just using one single source. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a little cut and paste action. Ready? I'm going to copy this, and I want you to watch how I do this, because this is one of the ways that I avoid plagiarism in my work. So I'm going to open up a Word document. And you notice that as soon as I took that quote, I put it in quotation marks. Right away, I wanted to remind myself that this is not my own text. I did not write this sentence. I wanted to make sure that I remembered that this was something that I got from an outside source. As soon as I put the quotation marks around it, I'm going to cite it for my works cited list. Okay, so at the very least, I'm going to go back to this and just copy and paste the basic information about this article, so that when I go to format my MLA citation, I'll have all the information I need, right? I can then produce this MLA citation very easily and surveys Jan, the media use of American youngsters, etc., etc., etc. For the sake of today, I'm going to skip that. But you'll notice then that I've got the MLA citation right at the top of my page, and then everything afterward I know is information from that source. Now, since this is a quote that I think I might actually want in my paper, like this first one here, I'm going to cite it right now. So Malikow and Surveys are the two authors, and they're the first things in my works cited source. That's how I knew to put their name. And there is a page number, so I'm going to go back to my source, and I'm going to figure out what the page number is. It's page 70. All right. Now notice I put the period after the parentheses, right? Did you guys see there used to be a period here in the quote? Well, I took that out. I moved it to the end of the sentence. So here's my quote, right? Here's my first step. I've figured out a piece of information that I want. So now what do I do with it next? Well, I could introduce the quote, right? I could say something like, in a journal article from Telematics Informatics about the social media experiences of teenagers, researchers note that adults are increasingly fragmenting their social networking experience, as a majority of those who use social networking sites, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so now I've introduced my quote with information that I think will raise its ethos, right? I've said it's from a very reputable journal, and I've explained the pitch, complaint, and moment in which it happens, right? It's a pitch that the authors are making about the social media experiences of teenagers. I've led into the quote, and then now here's step 3. We're going to have to analyze the quote. Okay, this is where that writing analytically gobbledygook is going to become way more clear. Okay, so Let's go back. Writing Analytically Chapter 14 makes this really important point, that you want to formulate a tentative position on your topic before you consult secondary sources. But guess what? You've already done that because you've already thought about your primary source analysis. Okay, you already have a tentative position on what your primary source means, right? Remember when we looked at that Verizon Rule of the Air commercial, our tentative feeling was that they were trying to appeal to a wide audience, right? A wide diversity of different kinds of people who use different social networking sites. So I'm going to put that down for a minute so we don't forget. Tentative position from PSA. That Verizon was trying to appeal to people, a wide variety of people who use a wide variety of social networking sites. Okay, now let's think about what our new piece of information from our new source, Telematics and Informatics, has done to change or qualify that position. We thought originally, looking at the PSA, that Verizon was trying to reach a bunch of people who all use different networking sites. But this quote is saying that adults use lots of networking sites, right? A single person might be on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. So this quote has given to us a new perspective. It's not that the commercial isn't looking for a wide variety of people, but it might mean that in fact the Verizon commercial is appealing to an audience that may have a presence on lots of different social networking sites. So we could actually write that in. We could say, given that the Verizon Air commercial shows many adults, there's a variety of adults networking on using different social networking sites such as Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and PhotoBucket. This journal article's insight may suggest that the Verizon Rule of the Air campaign is seeking to attract adults who use several of these social networking sites rather than adults who separately use just one of these sites. The appeal of Verizon, then, is meant to be related to its ability to keep you connected to multiple social networks at one time. See that? It's built on what we already had, okay? It didn't necessarily change what we already had. We already knew that Verizon was potentially appealing to a wide audience, but now we have a much more specific take on it, right? That it's appealing to a wide audience of people who in turn use a wide variety of social networks. That's really cool. So, notice on page 17 of Writing Analytically, they say clarify your meaning, relate your material to your evidence. That's what we just did, right? Do you see what I mean about writing analytically starts to kind of repeat itself? They're saying it lots of different ways because they want to reach you one way or another, but it's what we've just done in our example. So again, you're going to find that for the rest of this PowerPoint, I'm going to keep pointing back at our example. And let me put it over here to make sure that you guys can absolutely see it. I'd like you to take a moment just to read our example. Okay, just the example that I've given here so that you can see it really clearly on your screen. And then we're going to go back and we're going to look at it with that PowerPoint. So take a moment to pause your video and read what's on the screen. Okay, welcome back. So there's our quote from our source. And let's look at writing analytically and what they have to say about sources. They say, let's see. Sorry, guys. I don't know why it keeps jumping around on us. Make your sources speak, they say on page 219. Focus on how the source has led to the conclusion you draw from it. Fill the crucial site between the claim and evidence from your thinking. That's a fancy way to say tease out the implications, right? And that's exactly what we have done in our article, right? What's the implication of our new piece of evidence? The implication of our new piece of evidence is that the social media consumer is actually someone who uses multiple different sites of social networking, not just one. Okay, so let's see what else. They talk about these 6 strategies, right, to use with these sources. They basically say in strategy 1, don't just agree with your source. Well, we didn't, right? We raised new implications. We said, this is how this relates back to our primary source analysis. This is the connection that we're making, right? We're showing people why the party is so great because there was no alcohol, right? We're going to make that connection. Strategy 2, they say to quote and paraphrase. Oh, look, we did that. Strategy 3, analyze as you go. Oh, look, we did that too, right? Because of that step 3, that 3-step process, right? We introduced the quote, we gave the quote, we followed up the quote with analysis, so we did that, right? So we've been doing the same thing that writing analytically wants all along. Strategy 4 is very important. It asks us to use sources to ask questions. So remember, your secondary source provides new details, so how has it really changed your research questions? Well, in this case, it's changed our understanding of what the user actually looks like, right? So our original research question for that Verizon Rule of the Air commercial was, how does real-time constant access to social media sites affect usage patterns on these sites? Well, one thing that we know now really critically, excuse my cat, one thing that we know from our new source that we got together is that probably people are on multiple sites, right? So we would expect traffic to rise kind of on all of these sites if they had constant access, right? We wouldn't expect like just Facebook would get more hits. We would expect all of these sites to get more hits. So that's kind of changed the way we think about social media in that sense. Strategy 5 says, put your sources in conversation with each other. And again, this is kind of what we just did, but it's a cool way to think about it, okay? It's like a cartoon. So if your primary source and your secondary source were like people, and they were talking to each other at a party, what would they say to each other? Okay, so let's actually do that. Okay, I'm going to do a puppet show. Here's my primary source. My primary source says, hi, I'm the Verizon Rule of the Air commercial, and I show a lot of people who are using different kinds of social networks to post stuff. Okay, here comes my journal article from the informatics, right, that journal we just looked at. Hi, I'm a secondary source. Well, in my understanding, adults who use social networking, they actually use more than one social networking site at once. So the primary source is going to say back something like, oh, so I'm not really a commercial about lots of different kinds of people. I'm about people who might use lots and lots of different social networks, but all on the same phone. Secondary source would go, yeah, that sounds about right. Okay, I know that was supremely nerdy, but it was a way to think about it, right? So it was, you might play that game in your head, right? Like, really, if my sources were talking, what are they saying? And finally, strategy 6 says find your own role, but that's just a way to say make sure you analyze, right? Make sure you follow up the quote with your own analysis. Finally, these are my tips. Okay, this is not from writing analytically. This is my last piece of advice for the day. Agreeing is great. Okay, I happen to agree with this source. Did you guys notice? I didn't say like, you know what, I think this data is fragmented and bad and whatever. I said, you know what, that's a cool fact. I'm going to put that in my paper. But it's okay to also disagree with a source. Okay, you might find a source where you feel like there's evidence to the contrary, or you feel like the source doesn't really, it sort of contradicts your evidence and you have to work with that. That's okay too. Okay, right? This is not a game of like who can find all the evidence that agrees with their source. You might find evidence that's completely contrary to what you thought you would find, and that's fine too, right? You can also apply all these analysis techniques to that. And finally, don't forget to pitch the complaint in the moment, right? It's not just a reading strategy. It's also a great strategy for helping your reader understand how this article works. For example, if I were going to keep talking, if I were going to put more analysis here at the bottom, I would probably talk about how current this journal article is, how it's focused on this idea that there's a new upcoming generation of people, the millennials, who allegedly are even more plugged into social media than these adults that they're talking about. And I think about what the implications of the Verizon commercial are for that, right? So even though the Verizon commercial is showing people in their 20s and 30s, maybe it might actually be trying to talk to the millennials too, right? People in college and younger who are sort of already really plugged in. So I might also hook it up to the moment, right? The moment when this article is being published and how it's being thought about. So that's my 2 cents for today. I know that was a lot. It was 45 minutes, but I hope that was helpful to you. That's some of the stuff that I was hoping to talk about today in class. and I'll certainly touch on some of this on Thursday. But again, you have it here on YouTube. You can watch it as many times as you like. I'm going to leave it up here for the remainder of the quarter, so please feel free to sort of re-reference and recheck it out. And I'll see you on Thursday for questions and anything else that we need to talk about. And please come ready to talk about your writing workshop responses. Have a really great day. Stay safe. Please don't fall on the ice.